Wolfe's 37 Knucklehead got a flat rear tire, and probably some of it's due to me. I mean, the tire was wore out when I got it, but you can look at that tread. The tread's wore out. It was pretty bad when I got it, and I put 1,300 miles on it in the last few weeks, and then did a few skids on it for you guys in one of my earlier videos. You can go back and take a look at that. But regardless, the tire's flat. So I'm going to show you how you change the flat on a Harley Davidson Knucklehead, Panhead, Flathead rigid frame. How you do it on the side of the road. I'm going to do it out here in the parking lot on the asphalt. I limped it home on the flat, but I'm doing it here on the asphalt on the ground so you can see how you do it on the side of the road if you're stuck in this situation. So here's the procedure for using the frame stand. There's a clip here on the rear fender that just allows the frame stand to pivot down to the ground. And all you do is take the bike off its side stand. You know, we call it a kickstand. Harley Davidson and Indian back in the day called it a jiffy stand. But take it off the side stand, plant my foot on the rear stand, and I'm gonna grab the frame here, but on the other side, because I'm on the left side of the bike, and grab the fender here, and just pull back. Boom. And now you can see the rear tire spinning and off the ground because the frame stand's elevating the bike. Something I always keep in the saddlebag if you're riding an old rigid Harley Davidson like this is a big crescent wrench and a star hub wheel lug nut wrench. All right, you're gonna wanna pull the saddlebag out of the way. Taking it off is a total pain in the butt, but I found myself a stick I can use to prop it up, and that's gonna allow me access to the star hub. Now, here's one of the 5 lug nuts that my index finger is on the top of the hub here. Hope you can see that. But what you gotta do is roll the wheel around, and you're gonna take your lug wrench and go right through the hole in the frame, right into the lug nut. Then what you gotta do is press your foot on the foot brake so the wheel can't spin. Pull that lug wrench until you break that nut free. All right, and then you're gonna do this 5 times until the last one's out. And what that does is it uncouples the wheel hub from the brake drum, which is on the other side of the bike, because you can leave the brake drum in the bike and pull the axle and the wheel out and leave the brake and the chain in the motorcycle. All right, next step is to remove the axle. So you gotta take off this axle nut, and this is actually what allow the axle to slide through. Take off the axle and the lock tab. Now this nut and spacer actually hold the drum on. So a lot of times you can leave this on and tight without having to loosen it. Sometimes you need to loosen it so you can wiggle the wheel sideways in and out to get it out of the fender, but I'll go ahead and show you. And I don't have a hammer, but I just used the butt of my hand to knock that axle through. And then go ahead and pull through from the other side. The axle falls out, the spacer falls out, and I'm almost there. And this crescent's kind of big for this, but you know, I'm making the assumption you're stuck on the side of the road and you have limited tools. So instead of pulling out my whole toolbox, I'm gonna use what I have in the saddlebag and loosen up these hinge bolts on either side of the rear fender, because this fender is hinged. You don't take them all the way out. You just push the fender brace in and pull the fender back, and it swings up. Now you have great access to get the rear wheel out of the bike. And that's what the rear stand is for and what the fender hinge is for. Right, so the air's out of the tire. If you're trying to take the wheel off and the tire is inflated for some reason, letting air out, it gives you a lot more room to wiggle it. All right. Right, I'm sure now you're saying to yourself, okay, Billy Lane, if you got all the answers, how do I break the bead on that tire? But you're right, I do have all the answers. I'm gonna show you how to break the bead on the tire. You're gonna get your buddy who's riding with you to break the bead for you with his motorcycle. Right? You might not expect him to help you because you're on a knucklehead, he's on a big flathead. But you just roll the tire right over the tire without flattening the rim here, and that bead just pops right off. See if the other side needs to be broken. Sure does. I'm gonna do it again. Yeah, man, and there it is. I got the bead busted on both sides of the rim. Now I'll get the tire off the rim and swap it out. If you don't got friends to ride with, that's on you, that ain't on me. Remember, I'm trying to show you how you would do this if you're stuck on the side of the road with limited resources. So I wouldn't normally change a tire with screwdrivers. I'd use proper tire spoons, but you know, assuming you're on the side of the highway or out in the country somewhere and you don't have access to tire spoons, a couple big screwdrivers will work. You know, all of us have had this big Craftsman screwdriver you got from Sears back in the day. Everybody who rides has owned one. It's actually un-American not to own one because red, white, and blue. But anyway, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use my knees and push the bead of the tire back down into the drop center of the rim. And then really carefully, I'm gonna come back in this other side and pull the bead up over without getting my screwdriver into that inner tube because we have to assume you're gonna wanna reuse the inner tube. So I pull the tire up. Once you've worked it around a few times, you can generally lift the wheel up and pull the bead out with your fingers. Not as easy as it looks. I got that crazy kung fu grip, but it can be done. And then you're gonna wanna pop that valve stem and pull the inner tube out with your fingers. You want to just take a look at that tube, make sure if there's any marks on it where you hit it with a screwdriver, that you didn't puncture it, but there's no puncture marks on this one. Throw that somewhere where it's not going to get messy. And then here's how you get the tire off the other side. You're going to push the tire back from the side you've already released. You're going to take your screwdriver and pry against that like that, and then just push down your hands, and that bead will come off. Push down on the edges, and the bead will come off. Like that there. You see, this tire was flat, square, man, getting ready to roll through. What a mess. Okay, here's a new Coker 4.5 by 18 diamond tread. Here's the one that I just took off, obviously. This one's got some life in it. This one's as dead as disco. So you want to check around your rim to make sure there's nothing that's gonna potentially puncture your inner tube. Everything looks good here. Here's the procedure. You gotta basically shove this tire down in at an angle and get as much of the bead on as possible when you're doing this on the side of the road. So you're gonna go like this. See, I'll pull that bead around and I get a lot of it on that way. Now I just lay it flat, get with my screwdrivers, pop that bead over the edge as I push down. You want to be careful not to tear the bead with the screwdriver. But here's the last of that bead right here. Is about 10-inch section. See how easy I get that over. All right, now the whole one side's beaded. You're ready to install the inner tube. Right now you want to put your completely deflated inner tube back in. You can lift the bead on one side and get your valve stem in there. And you're gonna push that tire down. Okay, you're gonna pull that valve stem out. I got it held with my finger there. Then if you have a metal stem, you're gonna put the nut on it to keep it from popping out. I always just put the nut on a little bit so the stem can pop way back up in there. It makes the tube go in easier. You gotta fit this tube back in there and get it back in all the way down in the drop center of the rim, so that when you put the tire on, the bead of the tire doesn't pinch the tube. There's two things will pinch the tube: your tire irons or screwdriver, and the bead of your tire. So you gotta always make sure that you have that. You want to look for a balancing mark if there is one. There's not one on this tire. Now I'm gonna go ahead and remount, and how I remount is just like I took it off. I gotta put my weight on the tire and push it down over the bead using a screwdriver to get the tire over, but you got to be careful you don't puncture that tube. Just like that there. And then start working your way around. Get that tire bead back over the lip of the rim. Alright, so I got the tire back on with the inner tube inside. Before you inflate that tire, you got to get the rim back up in here, because with the tire inflated, it's really difficult to get everything lined up here. This is the tricky thing, is there's 10 holes in the hub, and there's 5 threaded holes and 5 positioning dowel pins that help support the torque of the wheel and the brake. So you've got to line up the holes on the rim that the bolts go through with the threaded holes, and the other 5 holes have to line up with the dowel pins. So you'll be paying attention to this when you get the wheel back in here. Back in she goes. And what I always like to do is get one of the threaded holes on top, and then I line up my rim as I put it in with one of the bolt holes on top, and that's how I know where my alignment's right. One of these big screwdrivers will be helpful in getting the rim in there. This is definitely a tricky job, but I got the rim lined up now, and then I'm basically in alignment with my dowels and my threaded rod. My dowels and my bolt holes are almost where everything needs to be. There we go. There you go. Now everything's in place, and I can just reinstall my lug nuts. Okay, now you're gonna go ahead and reinstall your lug bolts. And here's my thoughts on these. I don't use Loctite on them. For a shop situation, Loctite would be the best thing. The problem is if you're stuck on the side of the road, like I'm trying to show you here, Loctite can be a real problem for you when it comes to breaking them loose. So yes, it's great for them, but it can also cause you a lot of headaches. So I don't usually use Loctite. What I recommend is checking the tightness of these lug bolts about every 500 miles, because sometimes they'll work loose, and that way you always know they're tight. You don't have to wonder if the Loctite's holding them, and then when you need them out for some reason, you're able to get them out pretty easy. So I'm just going to put these 5 in just snug right now, then I'll get the axle back in, and then I'll use the rear brake to hold the wheel and torque these down. Okay, axle spacer back in with the big flange against the frame, small flange against the hub. All right, axle's through, lock tab back on. It's basically your lock washer. And my axle nut. Some big crescent wrench love. All right, now you want to carefully remove your stick. All right, now I just put my foot on the brake, torque these nuts in. That's all the torque you need. Roll it around. Here's my last one. All right. All right, now once again, carefully remove stick. Just swing your fender back down. Reattach the hinged fender to the fender brace. Everything's done. Only one thing left to do. That's inflate the tire. You know, usually pretty easy to find somebody that's got some compressed air somewhere. Even if you have to, a bicyclist with a bicycle pump, anything will work. Get some air in that tire. Even if you can get 10-15 pounds of air in it with a bicycle pump, you ride it somewhere that has compressed air, you can get your 30 pounds, 40 pounds, whatever you run in your rear tire. But that's how you do it on a Harley Davidson rigid frame.